Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar. We appreciate you joining us. We are going to reflect on another eventful and unpredictable year in college admissions. And while people are queuing into the room, I will pass this along to our moderator, Leslie Singer, who will get the program started.
Okay, so hi, I'm Leslie Singer of Brown Harris Stevens, and I am pleased to be able to moderate this evening with Dr. Barry Norman, who is the co-founder and head counselor of Expert Admissions, along with Sasha DeWind, who is the CEO of Tutor Associates. I believe, and you tell me if it's too soon is it too soon to go into our poll?
No, we can run the poll.
Do you want any housekeeping that you need to do first or anything?
Yeah, so as we got wonderful questions from registrants. Thank you so much. And I think you'll see those as we're going along. Of course, there may be additional questions that come up. And so if anything comes to mind, please just use the Q&A feature as opposed to the chat. We'll try to, kind of keep an eye on everything, but the Q&A is the easiest. And so if you could use the Q&A feature with any questions that come up, we'll do our best to keep an eye on that and answer them. And feel free to ask as we go, and we'll take them as we can, as best we can. In the meantime, I'm going to launch our poll to find out grade level wise who's in the audience so that we can tailor things a bit to who is here. So thank you for responding. I see people still letting us know. All right, so it looks like we have around 45, 46% 11th graders, about 36% 10th graders, and then 9th and 12th graders, smaller numbers. So not surprisingly, mostly 10th and 11th graders, and that percentage is actually starting to get a little bit closer as more people respond. So we will keep that in mind with our responses. And of course, like I said, feel free to ask questions that are particular to your year as we go.
Okay, well, I'm going to jump in. And Barry, first question, tell us a little bit about the big picture of admissions from the past year. And can you give us some stats, which I believe you actually have some charts?
Yes. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this has been a year like others that, kind of unexpected things that have come up. A little bit of just a broad overview first. So I would say there's been a lot going on, and a lot of this in particular, I would say on our end, the real significant change in the essay questions. We saw that as a result of the Supreme Court decision from last spring. We joked in earlier webinars that the lawyers would be writing the essay questions, and that was actually the case. We saw that in many of the essay questions released by the colleges that in fact they included and lifted actual language from the decision in the essay questions. And so they really were using the decision as a guidepost in terms of what they wanted to ask, what they could ask, and how they asked it. We also saw with these new essay questions a lot more embedded expectations in the questions. So sort of assumptions about the types of experiences that students had, what they might have gotten out of it, and an assumption that they were more extended experiences than they might typically be. And so that has informed our advising for younger students as we think about the future and how to plan best with extracurriculars and things like that. We saw obviously a continuation of test optional. We'll be talking about the pullback from that. Sasha will have a lot to say, but test optional was still technically in play. But as we've said on webinars prior, that was something that we knew was a possibility if needed, but was going to be plan B as opposed to kind of taking the pass. We always wanted to try to give scores when we could, as long as they were quote unquote good scores for a particular school. And we saw, for the most part, continued trends up in terms of number of applications. And so we saw increases of 10% over last year at places like Duke and Yale. We saw increases of about 53% in the last 5 years at Northeastern. Tufts had an increase of about 50% in the last 3 years and 75% in the last 5 years. These are, fairly, it's like odd to say, but somewhat typical numbers from these schools in terms of the increases. And so we did see it, obviously everybody kind of heard, and it was very widely reported about Harvard's decrease and a couple of other places with some decreases, but that wasn't the main headline. The increases, the continued steps up were kind of what we saw across the board. And yeah, Sasha, if you want to share a little bit about the testing piece for this year, in terms of overall, and then I can pull up some stats for people.
Sure, of course. Hi, just so you know, I did lose my voice last week. I have it back, but I have tea next to me, and so you'll just excuse me if there are coughs in between my explanations. Thank goodness this wasn't a week ago. So yes, we've seen a steady and continuous return to standardized testing for college admissions. Since pre-COVID, we had a handful of small liberal arts schools who were test optional. During and post COVID, you really saw a sweep of all the schools going test optional. We've spoken a lot in past webinars about what that means. It means, generally scores are preferred, but it has allowed certain students, a sprinkle, maybe, if you will, of students to still gain admission at even the most elite universities without scores, and certainly a wide range of schools. It has created a bubble with those scores, and we've talked a lot about that. But now, I think as a result of a number of things, admissions offices scrambling to figure out who's going to be successful, concerns about, what's equitable to those who maybe come from less well-known high schools or backgrounds. An array of concerns from admissions officers have turned the tides back once again. So, now we have, we already had MIT and Georgetown returning to requiring standardized testing. We have Yale, Dartmouth, Harvard reversing its decision, saying, no, I know we said the next 2 years will be test optional. We are not. Caltech, UT Austin, Cornell's giving kids a little bit more time till 2026, but reversing their decision as well, or at least returning to testing. And, I think we'll continue to see this with still some of the schools that have always been test optional remaining test optional. But certainly among the most elite schools and some of the bigger schools, we are seeing a return to testing. And I think we're going to continue to see announcements along these lines, although we'll have to wait and see how it plays out. And, I'm not sure how much this has an impact on, our kids who were largely, as Barry and Leslie and I were just discussing, the plan has always been to send great scores. Even during the test optional years in recent years. But now for certain schools, and certainly with a diverse list of schools, there may not be a plan B of maybe I will send to, Michigan, but I won't send to Yale. That's no longer going to be an option with a school like Yale requiring, and with other schools sure to follow. So we are sort of back to a whole new, or we're going to a whole new sort of era of admissions. And ultimately, I think this is maybe a more honest view of what we've already been encountering over the past few years, which is that top schools want to see scores, and they want to see excellent scores. And I think they're just being a little bit more honest about it now. So I'll always take a little bit more transparency, even if we have a little bit less choice.
Yeah, I think like we were talking before is absolutely, and we've always said, scores ideally. It doesn't mean, though, that you can't potentially have something work in your favor. And it gets harder the more selective the school is. Another thing also is that we've talked about on prior webinars is, those average or the mid 50% going up very high. That also reflected the reality of what scores you really needed, even though they were advertising wider ranges for the mid 50%. So like Sasha was saying, it really, in a lot of ways, it just sort of, it's like you can see what was really going on behind the curtain. And it's so interesting because not that long ago, they would say testing, told them nothing, and, and they would downplay it. And now once they took it away, now they say, oh, it gives us so much information. There's also things like grade inflation that has certainly gotten worse with the pandemic and hasn't never really recovered. And I think there are some, more sort of timely issues that are coming into play, but nonetheless, we're seeing it in the, here we go. Hold on. I want to show you here. We're seeing it in the numbers, right? So here you can see some of the numbers that I was mentioning. Yale and Duke aren't on this. I mean, Yale and wasn't on here, but you can see these are just pre-pandemic and post-pandemic increases, a number of applications. So just in the last 4 years, and no real movement, as you know, on the number of students that they're taking. And not, the absolute number. So we're seeing, again, the admit rates go down, but this is driven certainly somewhat by test optional, but we've seen over time these numbers go up, anyway. But they're really pretty striking, especially when you're looking at places that are experiencing close to 50% growth over 5 years. And like I said before, places like Yale and Duke, 10% year over year. Another bit that might be helpful is to look at admit rates. You can see here, it pretty much, not exactly, but kind of goes down. The Yale one, I'm not sure why it's doing that, because Yale had its lowest admit rate ever. So that might be a little bit of an error on that one. But you can see, generally speaking, the admit rates going down pretty steeply in one direction. You see that little spike. It was like 3 or 4 or something at Harvard this year, where the admit rate went up slightly, but was its highest admit rate in about 4 years nonetheless. And then also, just one other thing is, this might be helpful for parents out there. I put this together because I think it's so helpful for context. Everyone knows it's changed quite a bit, but how? So what the admit rate was for the high school graduating class of 1994, which is around the time that I graduated high school. So Princeton was 17%. What is that for this year? University of Virginia, just to kind of orient you to this graph. So when you look at MIT's rate of 30% in 1994, that's what Lafayette's admit rate is today for the high school class of 2024. And so this can just sort of situate parents a little bit of really just how much you need to reorient yourself, not necessarily that the numbers required or the scores required for certain schools today are the same as they were, although in many cases it is true, but just to get a sense of how competitive it's gotten really across the board. It's really trickled down, essentially.
A lot of information. Should I potentially move on to the next topic, which is very, very different? Has the recent campus unrest impacted students' choices for college?
Yes, this is something that's come up quite a bit, particularly, well, over the course of this year, but particularly in the last couple of weeks. Certainly it's impacting students and families' perceptions of schools and what they're considering and where they're looking. Some people may have seen the Free Press article about Southern schools becoming more popular. This is a trend that we've been seeing over the last handful of years. This isn't particular to now, although we certainly may see a spike in the fall. My experience so far this year has been that this is something that has impacted more the direction that people are looking at who have juniors, as opposed to the seniors who are kind of in play and have been in play for much of, kind of the, controversy on campuses this year. So there will be certain students, of course, who are seniors who will choose different places as a result of what's going on. When we have the conversations with families, regardless of the year, a lot of people who feel bewildered about what's going on college campuses right now will say, well, school A is really bad, but then when they look to the peer institutions, they're really essentially much the same. And so it's hard for people to differentiate on which one is worse. Is one really better than the other? And just kind of leads to a bit more confusion and people feeling like, there are just tough decisions to make. Again, for seniors now, they applied certainly after October 7th, most of them, but they applied before things were going on the way they are now on campuses. So there will be students and families that will take this into account, as they should. And I think it's important to ask the tough questions when you get to campus. And I think a lot of seniors felt like, understandably, things would have simmered down when they were thinking about this in early and even when they were applying for regular. But we've seen that that is not necessarily the case. So you've got to just take everything into account that's important to you and look in the places that might make the most sense. And for those also who may have seen, Brandeis made an announcement yesterday that they've extended their transfer deadline so that students across the nation who may feel unsafe or may feel that it's just too disruptive to be able to have the opportunity to make alternate plans. So we're definitely seeing some significant shifts.
Sasha, what is the current status of ACT and SAT testing, and are schools requiring them? And who does and who doesn't?
Yeah. So, certainly increasingly schools are requiring them again, and those top schools I mentioned, the Yale, the Dartmouth, Cornell in a couple years, MIT, Georgetown, Harvard, UT Austin, Caltech, sort of off the top of my head, those ones are already announcing, and I do think we'll see more announcements. Hopefully, as we get closer and closer to the fall, announcements will be about future classes. I really do think it's only fair to current juniors to give them time to make these decisions in advance. It's frustrating to not be able to plan ahead. Certainly current ninth and 10th graders have more time, and seniors are already done. And the SAT, I guess we've been talking now for over a year, probably, if not more, about the coming SAT changes. And Barry and I have done this such a long time, so I feels like the SAT is always changing to me. It's just like every few years they change it, but indeed they changed it once again in March of this past year. Was the first sitting of the brand new SAT, at least domestically. Internationally, it was earlier. And this new SAT, we certainly had some juniors take it. And then it'll be again, the second one will be in May. And in June, the new SAT is digital. You're taking it on a laptop. It's adaptive, which means how you do on the first module, they call it, or section, determines how you do on the second one. And it makes the algorithm a little bit more complicated because you're not just scoring amount correct minus amount skipped or incorrect. You are now taking into account, or the College Board is taking into account, the difficulty of the questions answered. So of course, it's in a student's interest not just to perform well, but to also be given the harder module on module 2. Everyone's getting the same one on the first round, and then it's changing and shifting. And the ACT, good old ACT, it doesn't, they announce a change, they go, never mind. Maybe we'll roll some things out slowly, but the ACT is really like that steady test that has changed just imperceptibly over the last 20 years. And so no changes there. It's, our kids are taking it, and obviously for I think obvious reasons, our current juniors have tended towards the ACT just because they didn't want to be guinea pigs on a brand new SAT. But we certainly have juniors who are taking the SAT, the brand new SAT. And then for our sophomores who are just now starting to think about, should I take the SAT or the ACT, which really is the first choice. The first choice is, which of these two comparable admissions tests should I pursue? And certainly for sophomores, I mean, the College Board just released more materials, I think yesterday. So of course, as these tests go on, the College Board releases more tests, they release more materials, there's more experience, there's more stabilization, kids are more likely to take it. So I expect that current sophomores will be a little bit more sort of amenable to the new SAT than the current juniors. Although I continue to think two things. One, it's case by case. Every child needs to make a decision. They should take a full-length SAT on a computer and have it scored, and an ACT, a full-length ACT on paper, because that's how it will be done. And certainly we proctor those and offer those. But those full-length tests should give you a sense of where you are, and sometimes it's really obvious right away where a child should go, which direction. And in other situations it's not so obvious, and I always think there's a why behind the what. The what's the scores. The why is, well, why are the scores that way? Was it timing? Which on the ACT, the answer is yes, it was timing, because for the ACT, it's always timing. Was it stamina? Was it a lack of content knowledge in a particular area? Was it a pattern on the test that they didn't intuitively sort of understand? And some things are easier or harder to fix. And so I do really encourage our current sophomores to try each and to dig into the scores, not just look at the what, but the why, and then to pick a path, and then really, like learning a foreign language, once you start on that path, you consistently work towards official dates. And we talk about this every webinar, but there's no right time to take these tests. There are kids who take it in the fall of their junior year. There are kids who take it in the winter of their junior year. There are kids who take it in the spring. I have kids waiting on accommodations, and we can talk more about accommodations, who are maybe even pushing it further back because they need that time. So the colleges won't be looking at which test you took. They don't have a preference, never did, don't now. SAT or ACT, it's about the scores. They don't have a preference when a child takes it. Fall of junior year, fall of senior year. They're not looking at the date. And really what they're looking at is ideally a concise testing portfolio where you're sending 1, 2, sometimes more than 2 sets of scores that are compelling and in line with what that school considers good. And Barry mentioned earlier, and then I'll stop rambling, but Barry mentioned earlier that 50, that range that is published, right? These schools do publish their score ranges. So, Georgetown will say their score range is, I'm making this up, guys, but like 33 to 35, something like that, which sounds right for Georgetown. And what Barry was referencing was that does signal admitted students were in that range. 50% of admitted students were in that range. 25% were above that range, i.e. a 36, and 25% were below that range. And so it's quite sort of easy to see data on admitted students to these schools, and what good means at Georgetown is different than, at another school. And I think we always suggest, and I know Barry certainly suggests, it's our job to take care of it. So it's like, Barry's like, why don't we go a little higher? I'm like, okay, why don't we go a little higher? But we always want our kids to be at the top of that range or above that range, whatever that range is, to feel like those scores are going to augment their application, and certainly allow them to sort of go to the next stage. So pick a test, either test. My preference, I have a sweet spot for the ACT because it doesn't change, but only because it doesn't change. There's no other reason I love the ACT. It is a pain in the butt too. There's nothing about it I like more. It's just that it doesn't change, and I like predictability. I'm a cautious lady. But other than that, you pick a test, you stick with it, you work towards it, you can learn it much like a foreign language. And then it's about strategically when you're taking it, and making sure you're prepared for it.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that a little bit, so I agree with everything that Sasha said. You're going to look at those mid 50% percentiles, and ideally, realistically, you're going to want to be towards the upper end of them. with something like the ACT, and it holds true for the SAT as well, but you're talking maybe, it depends on, it could be 10 or 30 points that might make a difference. But the difference between 1 point in your composite at one Ivy League school versus another, or one non-Ivy League school versus another, can make a difference on whether or not you're kind of like at entry level, or you're going to be clearing the bar, for that particular school. So there's the first looking at the range and trying to ideally be toward the upper end of it. And then there's the more nuanced question of, okay, now that I'm in that range, is that how realistic, or is this going to hold me back? Or impact my candidacy in any way. And so there'll be other questions that you ask once you figure out, am I in range or not? But when it does come to the scores, it's going to move. It's a kind of a moving target depending on the school and the student. But it is the case that once you clear the bar, you've cleared the bar. So, if 35 is good enough, like, you don't have to go in 2 more times to get the 36. We'll let you know, like, you've cleared the bar good enough. It's not going to hold you back. Move on and focus on other things that actually can help you and will make the difference.
Barry, you touched upon this a little bit earlier. Why are schools actually returning to testing?
I think the truth is, like I said, behind the curtain, I think it was being used and they need it. I mean, the grade inflation is a big part of this, right? Like, it feels like, and it's not the case, of course, but it's not everybody has straight A's, but so many people have straight A's that becomes less instructive than it used to. And by the way, even when the grade inflation wasn't there, the scores help them weed out applicants. They have these, just tremendous applicant pools. They need to find ways to pare them down. And even though they're not going to say it out loud, there's a way to do it pretty quickly. And while there might not be a literal cutoff, there is a point at which a score is just too low, no matter what else is going on. There will be anomalies and exceptions, but you'll know if that might apply to you or not. And it's not just a broad group either. It really will be particular to individual students at individual schools. But they need ways to, and they shouldn't feel ashamed to say that. Nobody said it's perfect, but it's the best thing we've got. And so until there's something else, this is what is there. And now they say it actually helps them identify talented students. Interestingly, they haven't said anything about, they haven't said too much about, kind of other students in the pool, how it factors in. But we've known that they've been using it pre-test optional, post-test optional. It's just helpful when you've got so many applicants and you need ways to differentiate between them.
Have any aspects of the application become more or less important? And are college admissions officers at elite schools looking for different things than they have in the past?
So I don't think they're necessarily looking for what I would call different things, but they absolutely are emphasizing things differently. The extracurricular piece has just become so central to the whole process. Of course, the academics need to be there. If the academics aren't there, nothing else is going to matter. So I want to be clear about that. But on average, about 80% of the applicants in any of the pools that our students tend to apply to are going to be academically qualified, meaning they can do the work if given the opportunity. And so that's great that we can get rid of, let's say, 20% of the applicant pool, but we still have thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of qualified applicants that need to be differentiated. And with the essay questions, for sure, as I mentioned earlier, particularly post-court decision, and just sort of the ways that students can utilize the essays, like kind of make the essays hustle for them. That's what they need to do. They can't just be well written. You can't just show you went on the website and looked up some classes and clubs and professors and, oh, look, what you have matches what I'm interested in. That's great. That might be why you want to go there, but that doesn't give them any compelling reason to choose you. And so, you really have to be able to communicate directly with each school, and what each of them is looking for is different. even places that we might think of and sort of clump together as being much the same. And so this extracurricular piece, I feel like, is something that we have to dig deeper into and that we need more of in terms of range, to be able to write the stellar kinds of essays that are going to make the difference in whether or not you get in.
And the different, have the applications become more or less, has any aspect of them become more or less important?
No, I mean, I do think the extracurriculars have become more
Yes,
important
sure.
for that reason, right?
Okay.
But I don't think overall, like, we generally speaking, we always said, it's the transcript, which rigor first and foremost, followed by the grades, followed by test scores, and then we have to say when required. But we know again that ideally you're going to submit them either way. And then we said, okay, activities, essays, things like that. That is still true. But I think you have to remember that to really be part of the conversation at whatever school you're applying to, it doesn't matter how low or high the admit rate is, to be part of the conversation, the academics, and I include in the academics, if scores are submitted, scores there, they have to be there. And once they're there, you're kind of, that door's closed behind you, and now it's all the rest of it. So it's really true that the softer factors, so long as you can pass through door number one of the academic review, it's really these softer factors that, as we call them, that really are making the difference in the decisions. Not just what you do, but how you do it, why you do it, how it translates, how it comes together, how you communicate it in your essays, not just generally, but to one school versus another. They're each compelled by different things. That's why you don't just see somebody get into Harvard, Yale, and Princeton just automatically. They're looking for, yes, similar things in some ways, but they tend to be compelled by different kinds of profiles. It doesn't mean that the same student can't present well to multiple, but just like anything else, you adjust what you say and how you say it depending on the audience you're speaking to. And it's the same is true here. But I do think the extracurriculars have just become so central to what really, at the end of the day, moves decisions.
And you touched upon this also before, but I'm going to ask it very directly for those that are listening. What does test optional really, really mean? And should students submit scores?
I'll take this one, Barry, and then if you think so. I mean, and of course, we still do have many schools who are test optional. I think this is where that sort of plan A, plan B comes in, which Barry and I were just talking about. Plan A is send scores. And different schools have released different statistics. Most have not released any statistics, as Barry has told us. But the ones who have, there's sort of variance among them about how many of the admitted students submitted scores. Sometimes it's 90% of kids are submitting scores. Sometimes it's 70% of admitted. Sometimes it's 50% of admitted students are submitting scores. So, every school has been different throughout these years, but the preference for us, and as we guide students, is to send scores that are in line with your grades, with your academic profile. And again, as Barry says, that's just one door you pass through, and then the conversation really begins. I don't think the scores get you in, they get you in that door, and then the conversation begins. And that's where who you truly are and how you convey it, which is where Barry's, I think, just so supremely talented, comes into play. And so test optional means send great scores. And I know there was a question in the chat about, have scores been inflated as a result of test optional? Well, yes, people who don't have the scores are much less likely to send if they don't have to, as they should. And so you are seeing people only with the kinds of scores who should be sending scores. And of course that does inflate it. But among the most selective universities, these were always the kinds of scores that kids were sending. So in some ways, some things seem like they're changing, and they've always kind of been the same. In order to get into the most elite schools, right, we're talking about sending superb scores, a superb transcript, and then you get through door one and you're moving on to what Barry references the softer side of things. So test optional means plan A is send a test score, and plan B, actually, how about we'll do plan A, B, and C. A is send great scores everywhere. Plan B is send scores to some places and not to others, depending on what the scores are or who requires it. And Plan C is you don't send scores. And every year there are kids who get into great test optional schools who did not send scores. And that is absolutely a possibility and something that has afforded certain kids really amazing opportunities they would not have in a test required atmosphere. That being said, those are, again, more anomalous and it depends on the school. And we are returning to an environment where that's less and less possible.
Yeah. I think with regard, it does depend where you're looking, right? It's always the case if you can, I mean, listen, it's just also you can have, there's more predictability to your results if you submit scores too. If you're a great fit, you know, we can take that into account with predictability, but you're never going to be a great fit at every single school on your list. It won't work that way. And so in order to have that, you know, broader predictability, the scores are super helpful. At the more selective schools, not surprising to see the announcements. And like Sasha said, shouldn't be surprising to see some more, you know, in the future. At the same time, most colleges aren't in that position to be able to just be like, now we're requiring tests. It's been very good for business to be test optional at these schools, for most schools. And so it's harder for some schools to go back, and they won't. And then there will be some that just need to be able to do their job and to be able to bring in a class that seems to make sense for them. So I think we're going to see a mix going forward. But you know, the more selective the school, and I don't think anybody's surprised at who has made these announcements. It's nobody that you wouldn't expect. I think just sometimes the timing of them, Harvard in particular, you know, reversing an existing policy and late in the cycle, you know, that it was the surprising part of it. Not that Harvard suddenly said, you know what, we need scores.
What would you say is a good score? And is there a difference between a 32 and a 34?
I mean, I think this goes back to where you're applying, right? There are schools, which a 32 is going to have you clear that bar that Barry talked about. And there are schools for whom it will not. And so this is a really school specific question. And one of the things, I know it's early when you're a sophomore or even a junior, sometimes you don't know where you're applying. But it's helpful to have a sense of sort of what kinds of schools based on your grades and your interests and you might be applying to, because the answer is a 32 will not do it at a lot of places, and it certainly will at others. And a 34 will do it at some places. And even there, Barry will say, how about a 35 at certain places? So it really does depend on the school, and it depends on your profile. And fortunately, all that data is published. So it is somewhat clear certainly to me and Barry, it's clear. It's clear to us where those schools are and who those schools are. And actually some of the schools abroad who are different, and we'll get to AP exams and we'll get to all that. Some of them, like, you know, St. Andrews will just say, you just need this score. They're so clear. They're like, anything above this is fine. The US schools don't say that, but they certainly give you a sense. And we know what will help you, you know, kind of fit in and pass that, you know, bar, clear that bar, if you will.
Yeah, and also something, just another kind of another point to kind of tack on to that is, you know, we've been talking about composite scores for the ACT, meaning the average of the 4 sections. The more selective the school, the more cautious and careful you also need to be about individual section scores, that we don't just kind of look at the composite, the best composite. We don't just look at the super score. You know, like everything else, the more selective the school, the nitpickier they are. And so, yes, we care about the composite and or the super score, but we also keep an eye on individual section scores as well.
And I don't want to go too into the weeds. And certainly one thing about me is I always want to talk to parents. So if you want to talk tomorrow or next week about your individual questions, I will talk your ear off about this stuff. But when Barry mentions super scoring or the subsections, just to be clear, both of these tests, the SAT has a math and a verbal section, and you receive a score out of 800 on each of them and they add them up to 1600, just like the old days, they're back. And then the ACT, which I think most of us are less familiar with from our own days taking these tests. I know I was. The ACT is out of 36. There are 4 subsections: English grammar, math, reading, and science. And they're averaged instead of added up. Why? There's no rhyme or reason, but they're averaged for a composite score out of 36. Why 36? I don't know, but here we are. So a 36 and a 1600 are comparable scores, right? They're perfect scores on these 2 tests. And what Barry's saying is that while many schools, and there's complications to this too, but while many schools will allow you to super score, take your best subsection, your best verbal over here and your best math over here, or your best English and reading over here and math, science, and mix and match them for your best overall super score, which is well named. What Barry is saying is that at the more selective the university, the more they're going to be looking into those, digging into those. And I know this has not changed in, I don't know, the 15 years we have known each other, but Barry has always said, I prefer a concise testing portfolio. There's never been a time, and nothing has changed as far as I know in Barry's. And that doesn't mean you can't use super scoring. It does not mean you cannot send more than one set of scores, but concise is better. And remember, to get to those high levels of high composites or high numbers out of 1600, you also have to do very well on all of the sections. So we just don't want any outliers. We don't want that one science section at a, whatever, 26 and everything else is the 34. We want to show, we don't want any red flags, nothing that signals anything other than this is clearing the bar.
We want them basically to look at the scores for about 2 seconds and move on. That's the goal.
That's it. All that work and all that time for 2 seconds.
Just breeze on by and wave as you walk through that door.
Right, but it's a very important 2 seconds. So, and it does clear into that so that you're part of the conversation. So it is important, but
absolutely important. But again, it really is. You just need to clear that bar. You need to clear that bar so that you can continue on in the process. And I always say, high scores won't get you in, but relatively low scores can keep you out. And so that's all.
That's all. How has ED changed over the years, and what about actually EA, and what are the differences? And I believe here too, you might have some statistics and charts to share as well.
I do. So here you can see ED and EA, what we call outcomes, kind of seeing what a few different schools do with their early applicants. So you can see here that Harvard defers 83% of their early action applicants. Shame, shame, shame. Why are you deferring 83% with any school? Why is any school deferring 83%? But certainly a school like Harvard with such a low admit rate. What does a deferral mean? You can see it doesn't really mean much, except that probably you're not getting in. So if you get, not that people don't get in, but again, 83% of applicants are getting deferred. So you can't really tell, is there hope? Or what are, does that mean they really are still considering me? Whereas if you look over at Yale and Brown, and Yale kind of started this a little bit, it got started around the same time in the last like 5-ish years, they've started to deny most of their early applicants. And I love that because it helps students move on. So if they know in November and December that you have no chance, they are not taking you under any circumstance in March, it might hurt when you get the flat deny, but it is a gift to you because you can now pivot and you can strategize for whether it's ED2 or regular, and you can start looking towards other schools and getting excited about those. But perhaps more importantly, strategically, you can know, should I go for something in ED2 or hang on through regular? It depends where you like and what application plans are offered. But the fact that places like Brown and Yale are denying most students, I again appreciate that. When I was in admissions, we would have decisions that often that would just be called defer to deny. And it was exactly that. We're going to defer the student now. We're going to deny them in regular. And when they came through in regular, we just would deny them as planned. And the thought was like, it's gentler to do that. And it was a different time, but it wasn't not the nicer thing to do because it kind of made people hang on when there was no hope for them. We literally just moved them through. They did technically go through committee, but in about 3 seconds. So if they know that they're going to do that, that's what they should do, even though it might not be the answer you want. It just helps you move forward. And you can see here as well, Williams doing a similar thing, not quite as much as at the other school, at the other schools, and MIT doing a fair amount of deferring, but not quite as much as its peer institution, Harvard. Another thing here I think is helpful. We often get asked, what's the difference in admit rates between the early rounds and regular, and is it easier or not? When you ask this at an information session, they say, oh, no, it's not easier. It's not easier. I think this speaks for itself. We've always known it's easier. It might not be easy, but your best shot at almost all schools. There are exceptions. Georgetown, of course, always, I'll say the anomaly to everything, but a handful of other schools as well. But it is going to, your best bet in almost every single instance is to throw your hat in the ring and early. And so you want to use that really smartly and really, really strategically. So here's just a little bit, just again, context for some of what's going on in some of the early pools. And by the way, I know that these slides represent more selective schools. It's not because those are the only students we work with. It's just not surprisingly, they're often the places that release the data and that the media and everybody are most interested in. So it's really what's available for this particular year, because it really is important year to year. So last year's data is available kind of for everywhere. But this is this year's data, which is most relevant to the juniors out there who are getting ready to apply, and just helpful for sophomores, because as you're getting to start thinking about the more specific things.
Thank you. Again, this is a question we touched upon a little bit earlier, but I'm going to ask it again, or anyway, ask the question. In determining whether to submit standardized test scores, how should middle 50% data be used?
I think, the most generic answer I can give, because again, it really is so particular, not only to each student, but then to each school that student is applying to, not just on the, looking at the academic piece, but how good of a fit are you, right? So there might be a place that's harder to get into where you can get in test optional even than a place that's technically easier to get into, but because you're such a good fit and should be able to execute in the application and communicate that, your chances are actually better. So the most generic answer I would give is to look at that middle 50% and submit if you're on the higher end. There are so many, kind of nuances and particulars to that, but that would be the generic answer.
And when do students, Sasha, when do students begin preparing for tests? When do they officially test? And is it ever too early to start?
Yes, it's sometimes too early to start. I'll start with that. I just spoke to a wonderful 9th grade family yesterday. And I just said, call me in a year. There's just if all you do is develop your passions and do interesting things and sleep and get great grades, even in 9th grade, by the end of 10th grade, I'll be thrilled to see you. But there's a couple of reasons why it can be too early, and then I'll address when to do it. To some extent, I think of these tests as one piece content and skills, like you got to know math, right? A 4th grader can't do these tests. And one piece sort of patterns and procedures, knowing the ins and outs of every piece of this test, and then having a procedure. And every time I see a verb tested, I do this. Every time I see a variable in the answer choice, I do that. That's part 2. And then 3 is performance, which I actually think is understated. You need to perform under pressure. You need to manage those thoughts and those feelings that come with testing. You need to deal with the kid tapping his pencil next to you who's so annoying. You have to wake up early. You have to deal with the cold room and the clocks behind you and all that stuff. Although we do have watches, so you should have a special watch. But so the piece that is content, that first piece where you have to just know math and grammar, I mean, you just haven't even done the math yet in ninth grade, right? You really, most of our sophomores have just finished it up, and there are exceptions there too. So some of it is just that. Some of it is burnout. I mean, if you just start something and you endlessly do it, I mean, it's like adding another academic class, and there's a huge opportunity cost to prepping, and it's worth it. You need those scores, but you need to do that strategically. It's why so many kids use their summers, particularly before senior year, but before junior year as well, because adding another class detracts from your schoolwork, which is a bar we know you're going to have to clear. And it's important to your learning. So I would say that it's always a good idea sometime in the spring of 10th grade or early summer after 10th grade to diagnose. And by diagnose, I mean pick your test and figure out how far you are from your goals. I mean, every year there's a handful of kids who are so close to their goals and they're just like, we'll just take it and be done. Great. And most kids, the wide, vast majority, are very far from their goals because this is like a foreign language and they need to learn it. And then there's so many factors that come into when are we going to officially test. And as I mentioned earlier, some do it in the fall, some do it in the winter, some do it in the spring, and almost all of them come back senior year to do something. And the reason they come back senior year to do something is because of that third piece, the performance piece. That's when they're rested, they're confident, they already have some great scores under their belt, and they just sort of knock it out of the park without a lot of prep or stress. And when I'm talking to parents about when to officially test, I'm taking into account so many different things. Some kids are away all spring at a program abroad or at the mountain school. Some kids have really intensive spring sports, but their summer and fall is wide open and they're ready to get down to business and they're pretty close. Some kids are waiting on accommodations. So each child is different, and there's and ignore your friends who are saying, oh, my kid did it one and done. September of junior year, they're done. They're not done. It's like they have so much time, and they really have all the way through October of senior year to finish it. There's no rush to get the scores. You cannot go back and redo chemistry. You can't, if you don't do well in your chemistry class or your French class, or you can't go back and redo that. But the test, there are so many opportunities for kids to test. And I do think that once you get going prepping, my least favorite thing is like, we start, we stop, we take a little break, we come back to it, we do it, we don't do it. It's a foreign language. You start, you do it really consistently, and then you're done. And then maybe you take a long, long, long break and finish up your junior year, and you come back to it for senior year with or without tutoring, with or without, just maybe a little practice. So again, like Barry, there's the generic answer, which is like probably sometime junior year and maybe again senior year. And then there's the specific answer, which is that children have all sorts of different courses and needs and sports and summer plans and goals, and it's just really needs to be customized and tailored to your child's needs. And you need to think about when they're mentally ready, and you need to think about when they have the time to put in the work, because it is like taking on a sixth academic course.
I do think that and I understand why people think that there's a knee-jerk reaction, because we would say, okay, I hear you, Sasha, it's gonna take a lot of energy and time and effort. So we wanna start earlier because there's such limited time. And if we start earlier, we can spread it out over longer and it will be less stressful. And that is actually very logical, except that in practice, and Sasha alluded to this before, there's just this burnout that will happen, that if you start a kid too early and they, also, by the way, I know it sounds like a little bit like extra, but developmentally, they're not ready often, and so you kind of just need you need development to happen. You need them to get a little bit more under their belt at school. You need them to become better test takers, like whatever. There's a lot of different things that go into it. But I often will see people who do really push and insist on starting early in 10th grade. And these are people who know they need a lot of prep. their kid works for a long time. They hit a plateau because, again, developmentally, they're going to be at a certain point, and school content-wise, they're going to be at a certain point. And then they get frustrated and discouraged. And they're like, I've been doing this for 7 months, and I'm only here. And it's like, if only you would have waited, they tend to burn out like right when we can start getting the best out of them. If you can grab your score at the beginning of 10th grade and you miss the window, you can grab it at the beginning of 11th. You can grab it at the end of 10th. You can grab it at the beginning of 12th. You're not going to lose it. It's not like this, thing that you grab for a moment and then it's gone. So what if maybe you could have grabbed it a few months earlier? But I really find that when kids start too early, they end up finishing later, actually, because they need a break and they spin their wheels for a little too long. We want this to be, as we want to minimize the stress, and we want to do it concisely, not just because that's what we want to present to the colleges, but we don't want the student to have to suffer through something unnecessarily either. And they have to keep an eye on their academics, and they have to do all the other things. So it's not like they all have all this extra time to have this on their plate for longer than need be. So the benefit of talking to your counselor, the benefit of talking to Sasha and her team, is they can help you identify when it makes sense. We tend to chime in on kind of when it's okay to stop, like it's good enough or it's not good enough, you need to keep going. We're often asking people to stretch a little bit more between administrations, because if you really do need a pop, like, why do you expect that in 3 weeks from now, when the next test is happening, that you're going to suddenly jump so significantly? Like, they're human beings, not robots. And so we all want to get this part over with. No offense to Sasha, I know she agrees with me.
Yeah,
We
I do
all want
too.
to get this part over with, but we got to do it right. And it's only over if we have what we need. So if you want to just kind of hurry it up and everything, but you can't get what we need, all it does is kind of add more stress and anxiety for the student.
And I'll also say that that's one of the other reasons I kind of was offhandedly saying I prefer the ACT, because it doesn't change, which is the primary reason I prefer it. But the other thing about the ACT is I don't love the SAT dates. Like, this is a pretty arbitrary thing, but it's not arbitrary, because when you're talking about the first Saturday of May and the first Saturday of June as two of the main junior year those are very, very difficult times for an 11th grader to test. Psychologically, they are burnt out. They are busy with research papers. They often have cumulative exams. I mean, the juniors that I talk to are like, they're barely sleeping at that point. So my only advice is plan early. That doesn't mean you start early, and plan for your child. And the ACT is like, yeah, we'll give you February, April. I'm like, oh, I love a February, April. And then they give you a mid-June. And I'm like, yeah, maybe they have a week when they're back from boarding school to just like relax before it. So sometimes it comes down to just when these tests are offered. I love a July ACT. Like, what's your kid? Your kid's not stressed out in July. And calm, confident, rested kids do better, because, as Barry said, they're not robots. I also know there are so many questions in the chat that we're not going to get to because it's 8:57, but I mean it, that I do want to answer these questions. I know Barry will too. So especially those questions about individual things, how many tests to send and when and how and where, I'm more than happy. You just shoot me an email at sasha@tutororassociates.com and we'll set up a phone call. So I just wanted to put that in there because I'm seeing your questions about AP exams.
Yeah, there are many of them.
There are many of them.
I want to answer them. It makes me crazy not to answer them.
Sure.
So
This is kind of a different question. We do have a couple minutes, but it's an important question. How should students think about creating a well-rounded college list? And what is a right fit? You hear of that phrase.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's two pieces there. One is about fit and one is about a list, and they're connected, of course. But I would say the way that you should start your search is to first figure out what you want versus what you need. And then once you've identified that, some of those things, the things that you need are going to be the deal breakers. The things that you want are going to be the things you're seeking generally in the schools. You'll come up with a list of schools through your own research, through talking to your counselor, talking to other people. You come up with a list. You're going to come up with a list that has certain things in common, right? The things that you've identified. You're also going to need a range. I don't think it's realistic to think that you're going to start your college list building and, very relatively quickly or in a short period of time, you're going to have this range of schools, of places that you like, that kind of reflect fit. I mean, this is a long ongoing process that happens over time. So you might have a core group of schools or know where you're kind of generally looking fairly quickly, but really getting a strategic list together is very much an art and a science. And some of it is going to require data points and other things that happen as you make your way through not only junior year, but even somewhat into the beginning of senior year, certainly taking into account over summer what happens. And then maybe, like Sasha said, I love the fall senior year tests. We often see nice big jumps with very little preparation or effort for students. Like Sasha said, they're just well rested. They're a little bit more, developed. They're just older, wiser, rested. It's a great recipe for doing well. But you're going to then have to start thinking about how each individual school is different from one another. And that's something you have to also pay attention to as you're researching. But what you really have to keep in there is what you want and what you need. And then you have to start becoming familiar with the colleges individually to see if they think that you would be a good fit for their community. And a good fit has nothing to do with how much you think you fit, how much you want to go there, how well you could do the work. It has to do with how each individual admissions office pulls together a class. And that's something that we pay attention to and have paid attention to over the last 20 years but that fit piece, we don't always necessarily agree with it, but it is what it is. And so really becoming familiar with the schools and the kinds of students that they tend to find compelling. And again, I can give you examples of a student who isn't like the typical compelling profile for X or Y that got in. I can give you examples of everything, but you're talking about a strategy that you set out with before you know all the answers. And so the breadth is going to be important. The range is going to be important, and fit is king. If you don't fit, you can have the grades, you can have the scores, you can be really smart, and you can have a 0% chance at getting into a place that you're even on the high end of the range. So it's really important to get to know the schools and to get to know yourself.
We do have a ton of questions. I don't know if you want to review some of them. If you, as Sasha said, it's getting late. If you want to be able to talk to, individuals tomorrow. I know both of you are so amazing, and this is such we're so appreciative of your time. So, you tell me.
I think so many of the questions, not all of them. I mean, I see things about testing multiple times and APs
Yes,
and
so do
things
I.
like that. But and we can get, but I just think so much of this is personal to your child, and personal to your school list. So I encourage you to email us. I know Barry will send out a recording of this so that if you missed anything or you want to send it around, I know lots of people emailed me saying they couldn't make it live. But if you want to email me, excuse me, there's that cough, Sasha at tutorossociates.com. I think it's more productive to have those conversations about your individual child. Plus I love talking to moms and dads. So I can't help it. It's what I meant to do. So that's what, I would suggest, just because we have limited time, and Barry and I could do this for
Hours.
years,
I
hours,
know. Yeah,
years.
hours, years, months, whatever. Well, I cannot thank you both enough. It is a wealth of information, and you always bring it with a very warm and inviting and non-threatening way. So you make it, just most appreciative of your time.
So sweet. I will say Barry and I have done this a long time, and every year we have happy kids in happy sweatshirts where they're off to school. And it may seem scary, but our kids they do find their fit, and they do end up happy. So keep that hope. I have a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old. So I'm saying this to myself too. I'm like, they'll end up just fine. It'll be fine. I'll call Barry. But thank you, Leslie. You're always so lovely, and we so appreciate you.
Yes, thank you so much. And the process actually, yes, it is complicated, unnecessarily so sometimes, but it can also be a lot of fun. So don't forget that either.
Absolutely. Well said.
All right. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Good night.